Hello.
Hi,
So I'm really,
I'm so glad to be here today.
yes, me too. And I was just going to say that I feel so excited. And today we're going to talk about parenting and ADHD. And we're also doing it for the podcast, Mental Health for Working Parents. And I'm really excited to have you because I'm still kind of learning. As I've told you before, I'm still learning about ADHD. It's not something that I've been um, focusing on in my work. So yeah, so if you could just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you, and also what's your journey, I guess, with ADHD, and kind of how did you come to your specialization?
Yeah, happy to. Um, it all started when my son was diagnosed with ADHD. He was 7 at the time. And the more I learned about it in order to help him, the more it started to sound really familiar.
Mm.
It started to explain a whole lot of the struggles that I faced when I was a student. And finally, it all started adding up so much that I finally went to my doctor and said, "Hey, do you think this could be me?" And she kind of said, "Yeah, it's amazing that you have lived into your mid 40s without
Mm.
knowing that you had ADHD." So, like so many, I came to my diagnosis later in life as well, courtesy of my kids.
Mm.
And so when I was learning all about my son and all about ADHD as much as I could, I realized also that I was looking at all of it through sort of a physical fitness lens because my my first set of training was in the dance world. And after that, I sort of kept up with that by becoming a personal trainer and a health coach. Um, so a lot of my life is lived active, actively. Um, and I realized that all of the research that I was reading about my son was focused on either the brain alone or reaching the brain first in order to get the body to cooperate.
Mm.
And maybe it's because of ADHD, or maybe I'm just a natural contrarian. I decided to attempt it backwards and try to access the body first to get the brain online. So I did a bunch of experimenting with myself and my kids, and a lot of it worked. A lot of it didn't. But the more I tried, the more I shared with other friends who said that it really worked for their ADHD family. And so over time, over the years, I developed a 4 point framework that I use in coaching now women, but in the past, families and kids with ADHD. The 4 points are exercise, nutrition, metacognition, and mindfulness.
Mm.
And then the last is systems, habits, and tools, which are all the kind of practical things that we think about, the planners and the timers and the minders and stuff. So I'm excited to be doing this work in large part because there's so much shame and so much stigma attached to ADHD, especially for women, especially when we don't learn about it until later in life. And it really is important to me to knock down some of those barriers and help people realize that ADHD is actually not a deficit at all. It's a different way of thinking. And the more differences we all can bring to the table, the better teams we build, better families we build. And it's a good thing. Different is good.
Mm. And I think, I have so many questions just in terms of what you've shared. And I guess I just want to start, I think, and again, like this is something, that we've spoken about before. So this is also from my experience. I think a lot of parents who are kind of coming or like navigating some, I guess, the challenges that they've been facing throughout life, but they're kind of coming towards the kind of moment where they're really starting to look, into ADHD, or, even if it's going to be helpful for them to get like an assessment for ADHD. But a lot of them come to that point throughout their kids, whether because they're kind of starting to, I guess, like struggle with like certain stages of parenting, or they, you know, might think that their children might benefit from like having an additional support. But can you just talk about like how that part of your journey, as you were kind of started to connect some of the dots, so you were questioning that? Because I'm really kind of curious as to give like parents some information about, you know, what are some of the, I don't want to call them symptoms, because, you know, I really kind of hear and agree with you that I don't even like think that it's helpful, right, to think about ADHD as kind of a set of symptoms, also because how different it is and how like individual all of them are. But just what are kind of the elements of parenting, whether like for a parent or a child, that kind of would be, I guess, those moments where you think, okay, this ADHD is something that might be helpful or supportive to consider.
So you're looking for signs that maybe an evaluation is in order?
Yeah, just like as a parent, you know, like what's kind of typical, I guess, like challenges that you would face, obviously, in addition to that parenting is challenging by definition, right? And all of us kind of struggle. But what would be, I guess, like specific to ADHD, where you think this is where it will be helpful for me to kind of understand that, you know, perhaps I might have ADHD and I would need additional support, or that my kid might have ADHD, but then I'm, as a parent, could offer them additional support.
Yeah. Okay. So let's tackle the kid side first. Some of the earliest signs that I actually missed but made sense in retrospect were sleep difficulties. My son in particular was like, he was driven by a motor. I mean, his mind couldn't slow down at bedtime. In fact, it kind of got a little bit ramped up because there was less stimulation happening in his environment, and that gave his brain space to speed up a bit. So sleep challenges, of course. Many people are familiar with the stereotypical jumpy, fidgety boy. That's what a lot of people tend to think of when they think of ADHD. And that can be true. The H, which stands for hyperactive, also can be very internal. A lot of times that's what we see with females or people assigned female at birth. The H is inside. So it's a brain that's always going. A lot of times the first feedback that a parent gets, especially if it's a first child and they don't have anything to compare it to, the first feedback that a parent will get is from school. So either a kid who has real difficulty staying in place or staying in line or keeping quiet when they're supposed to, or a child who appears to be very daydreamy or maybe is off task and distracted a lot. These are all really kind of classic signs that there's something happening with executive function. Whether it's ADHD or not really does require a professional evaluation, but those are some of the things to look for in a kid. Another component that is often overlooked is the piece around emotional regulation. So ADHD really is it's the wrong name. You know, it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But first of all, it's, again, not a disorder. It's just a different way of thinking. And it's not even really a deficit of attention. It's really a surplus of attention coupled with a difficulty in steering that attention where adults think it ought to go, or where the adult themselves want it to go. So emotional regulation is a part of that. Trying to notice what we're feeling and put the brakes on that when we need to. So what that can look like, in effect, is a very quick temper, being very quick to react to anything, having outsized emotions. There's something called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is often associated with ADHD, and it makes kids not only it makes all people with ADHD, extra sensitive to any slight perception that they might be getting judged, that somebody else might be disappointed in them, that there's any shame happening. Not only does it make them extra sensitive, but it hurts them more. It lights up the brain centers related to pain even more than it does for the average person. So all that is to say, anytime a kid is having trouble regulating attention, energy, emotion, tasks, information, there may be some executive function challenges there. Now, on the adult side, all the same is true, but once we reach adulthood, if we haven't learned previously that we have ADHD, then it starts to look like a person who takes on personality traits of being scattered or disorganized or unmotivated or feeling like they can just never get their stuff together. Now, all of those things, of course, are not true, but those are the messages that we tend to get over the course of a lifetime, and we often will interpret them and believe that that's quote unquote just the way we are, when actually in some cases it's something else entirely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and you know, it also kind of, I guess, offers like so many different things to consider, right? Because like as you were talking, you know, about obviously kind of some of the challenges, I guess, like with the structure for children, you know, and that kind of, especially like when it comes to quite a rigid structure, like for example, you know, obviously school, I guess, as an example of that, you know. And I think very often, I guess like a lot of, I think challenges come through that can also be, you know, like ADHD related or not. But how, in your experience, how helpful it is actually get the diagnosis of ADHD? Because I question with any actually diagnosis, I guess like there's like a helpful part, but then also it can be quite, I guess, like, you know, part of like pathologizing, you know, the whole, as you said, you know, I also don't view it as a disorder, but kind of getting the diagnosis could also be part of the message. This is just who you are, as opposed to, you know, this is a difference, and let's just kind of talk about the coping like strategies, or what kind of additional support you would benefit from, or like as a parent, you know, let me as a professional help you, right, with what will make parenting, for example, less stressful if you or your child has just like some unique qualities or demands. So I don't know, it's a question, yeah, which I've been just reflecting on for myself.
Yeah, I think it's really important to get a diagnosis, first and foremost, because there are other things that can mimic ADHD, like anxiety disorder, for instance. But we would go about treating them or approaching them in a very different way from the way that you would ADHD. And so, you know, knowledge is power. I think it's really empowering to know what your thinking style is, so that you then can begin to work with your brain instead of against it. And so you know what you're dealing with, because in that example, if a person had anxiety that was making them have challenges in regulating themselves, that's a whole different story than trying to self-regulate with ADHD. So there's that. And at the same time, if a person decides to seek diagnosis, either for their child or for themselves, I find it really important to find a good fit with the evaluator, the provider that's going to administer the assessment. Hopefully, I think there is a growing population of providers who are strength-based and are starting to realize that, you know, despite what it's called in the DSM-5, it doesn't have to be pathologized. It doesn't have to be thought of as a disorder or something to be treated and cured. It can just be a natural difference. So finding that good fit with a strength-based provider is a really important part of diagnosis for me.
Yeah.
I also think that as you said, ADHD does occur differently for different people, even throughout different phases of life, sometimes even throughout different phases of one day. So it's possible that a person may reach adulthood without ever having been really bothered by ADHD that they didn't know was there. But in later stages of life, number one, hormones may shift and start changing. Number two, circumstances may change. Enter the big parenting question. Mm-hmm. That's one of the biggest life changes that possibly can occur. But there are others like job changes and all kinds of other things that can make challenges come to the surface when maybe they weren't there before.
Yeah.
And there again, diagnosis is empowering. There's no reason to have to suffer and white knuckle your way through executive function challenges if you don't have to.
Yeah. And I think also, I think obviously parenting kind of brings out, I guess, like everything that was like unresolved or unknown, and I think once we become parents, as you've said, it's such a major transformation that really, even if something, all of the kind of coping strategies that we've had before, right, as we become parents, they might just kind of not work. And it's really a question, okay, so how can, and also obviously it's not enough to support ourselves, then we also kind of need to have a capacity to support like a child, and the demands can be so different and conflicting in many ways. So I think it just really makes so much sense that like from what you were sharing, but also some of the people that I've spoken about get really diagnosed when or kind of maybe after their children get diagnosed. And I think just having almost kind of like that also, I guess, is normalizing that kind of, if you have it as a child, and then I also kind of curious as to like exploring some of my challenges, and perhaps it also kind of can be like a point of connection, I guess, and like an additional kind of connection where it's just normalizing how kind of we, I don't know, like see the world, or like what kind of support we need, or just perhaps, like removing some of the demands and expectations, I guess, that I'm not going to expect you or me as well as a parent to fit into some kind of structure that is perhaps not designed to be welcoming in that way.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting that you said that. When I was first diagnosed, one of the first feelings I remember having was the sense of guilt almost, and responsibility that my kids would have these extra challenges in life because of my genetic code that I passed on. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, that feeling was brief, because what I started to realize after that was, this gives me a unique advantage to understand my kids, to bond with them, connect with them, to learn about myself even as I'm learning about them, and to be able to model this idea that we develop over the course of a lifetime. We don't just get through high school or through college and stop growing and learning and developing. It lasts forever. That's what I want most for my kids, is for them to be lifelong learners. And so once I sort of reframed it in that way and realized, well, we can be learning partners together through this journey, it really, it helped settle my fears and guilt about the extra challenge that is sometimes created.
Yeah. And I also think it's such a wonderful way to look at it. So, I just want to recognize it. I think I kind of imagine, because, I also, I guess, like question some of my challenges, as I was kind of growing up and recently, and I have been like someone who's been like incredibly well functioning, I guess, in that sense, but all of those kind of issues, like with the structure, school, I never was like particularly good at. And, I think obviously now, like with my older son, I also kind of question some of the things. And specifically, I just wanted to ask you, because as I was reading, like preparing for our talk, I was also reading about PDA as kind of part of ADHD. So I don't know if you could just kind of talk a bit about it and also explain, because I think that sounds like it could be such an like major challenge for many people, especially for parents, if that's like one of the, I guess, like elements of ADHD for a child. And obviously as a parent, that could be so challenging to navigate.
Yeah. Boy, is it. There are a few things more frustrating in the world for a parent than a kid who just seemingly won't do what we want them to do. What there is a way of looking at it that tells us it's not a won't, but instead a can't. But in many cases, at first at least, it seems like a kid who just won't do the thing. I don't have exact figures on the prevalence of the overlap, but anecdotally, I will tell you it's really, really common for. I think in the States we call it oppositional defiant disorder, but either that or PDA, pathological demand avoidance. I think it's really common. My hunch, and this is just my conjecture here, but my hunch is that it may come from possibly two different arenas. The first is ADHD tends to give us a fair amount of creativity, and because our filter for information is fairly wide, rather than just accepting things status quo and going about whatever it is we're told to do, a lot of times we have questions in our minds like, why does it have to be done that way? Why do I have to do it now? Why does
It's very valid.
anything happen to be the way that it is? So, even in challenging situations like that, there can be an upside. It's possible that the other avenue is that kids who have ADHD, before they reach the age of 12, on average, they have heard 20,000 more negative messages than their neurotypical peers.
This is just terrible.
So you can just imagine a kid constantly hearing, yeah, a kid who's constantly hearing, well, you're not doing enough, you're not doing it right, you must do this, you must do it that way. They get tired of it.
Yeah.
They get tired of it. And
so, even just like, I think just this is very standard, like generally for us as parents. And this is, I think, how our like just human brain works, like with a negative bias, when we just kind of focusing on like negative things first as part of our survival mechanism, right? We kind of tend to pick up on things that go wrong, or like in ourselves, things that we don't like, or the feelings that we perceive negative. So I think just generally as like humans, we're so kind of overly negative when we talk to each other, because I don't think we like give each other enough kind of recognition, praise, like positive strokes.
yeah.
But when you were saying that how it can be like intensified for someone with ADHD, it just blows my mind, and how really heavy can it be, and just so difficult to tolerate and navigate without actually knowing, as you said, just by really questioning those messages, which actually is such a normal thing to do, like to have a response, why this demand is being placed on me, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And so like this kind of, so like basically what you're saying, that kind of PDA is really about like this resistance to kind of respond in a certain way to the demands that are being placed from like externally.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not a clinician. You'd be better positioned to talk about the clinical aspects of it. But anecdotally, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, and when parents have the best intentions of setting up routines and structures and very clear expectations, that can work great for a lot of kids. But when there is a PDA aspect to ADHD, or a resistance to authority, I think it is probably exacerbated by the ADHD need for novelty.
Mhm.
In other words, it gets really boring to do the same thing in the same way all the time. And sometimes folks just need to shake it up. And that can come as a shock to a parent who has gone to great lengths and great effort to set up this elaborate structure. It can be a little jarring to hear a kid say, well, I don't want to brush my teeth first. I want to put on my pajamas first and then brush my teeth. So, to the extent that we can be flexible about such things,
Yeah.
it really helps everybody.
And I think, there's kind of a whole, I guess, set of like challenges that comes with that because, I'm just kind of thinking about just like a conversation I had in my son's school about like when I was dropping him off and he was just really upset. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to go in class because it was like after family vacation, and he's been kind of off school for a couple of weeks. And he was just like really upset and he was taking his time to go to class. And then his teacher, who is wonderful, by the way, and she's very lovely, but she kind of came out and she was just like talking. She was like, this is a power struggle. If you kind of take him to the class, he's going to be okay in 2 minutes, but it's almost like this, like presented or can be presented, or we can be taught, right? That all of that, what you're sharing as well, is kind of that part of like power struggle, whatever it means, as if like kids can actually be more powerful psychologically as parents, right? But also I think that like transgenerational messages, he's like spoiled. You've never been spoiled like that, from grandparents, right? For example, who actually just grew up with a very different sets of rules or like not having an access to some of the information. So it can really be like a difficult, I guess, place for parents where they might perceive that they don't have a choice as to just kind of start trying, like to suppress those kind of like that resistance because of those messages. You kind of need to fit in. You don't want your child to be spoiled. You don't like need to be kind of too overprotective. You just need to, yeah, you just kind of need to fit in this box that I guess at some level all of us are existing in.
I think you're absolutely right. And it kind of speaks to the old view of ADHD as a moral failing, a lack of character and, uh, you know, character strength, I suppose. Those were the old days. Now we know enough to know that it's not that way at all. There's a biological basis for it, and there really are some things that people with ADHD struggle with through no fault or control of their own. Changing the environment and certain circumstances around that person can certainly help. And what you described was a perfect example of that. It's not so much a power struggle. Kids are not nearly as manipulative as some adults might make them out to be. Behavior expresses a need, and your son was expressing a need to stay with you a little longer or express some other big feeling he was having. So taking care of that in the moment, I think, is a brilliant and gentle way to go with it.
And before you were talking about, kind of, I guess, the connection in between ADHD and anxiety, and how I think you were saying how like very often kind of, I guess, anxiety can be confused with ADHD or like vice versa. Can you just kind of talk a bit more about that? What's your experience with that? Because I also kind of see that quite a lot in like in my work, but also in what I've read kind of when I was preparing for our talk. So I'm really curious about that.
Yeah. Somewhere around 2/3 of people with ADHD also have a co-condition, which can be a mood disorder like anxiety or depression. So it's really, really common for them to overlap, which can be even more confusing than when it's just one or the other. Um, but a lot of the signs of anxiety can look like ADHD in that the mind is occupied elsewhere. So it looks like distraction. And there can be a whole lot of difficulty regulating emotions, which also looks like, ADHD and RSD. So they can be separate or they can be together, and they're both really confusing. There may be people much smarter than I am are studying this right now as we speak, but there may eventually be proof, be scientific evidence that the brain structures implicated in both anxiety and ADHD are related and different from the neurotypical population. My own hunch is that a lot of people with ADHD, because of their sensitivity, because of their tendency to notice all the things in the world around them without much of a filter for keeping out extraneous detail, their nervous systems tend to get overloaded. And when that happens, we end up seeing signs of anxiety. Mm. That even that can have certain upsides. It leads people with ADHD and or anxiety to have great empathy for other people, to have a whole lot of compassion, and to be really good at picking up on nonverbal communication, which often makes them really terrific in relationships, especially in leadership kinds of relationships, because they have this empathy and they're able to communicate really well.
Yeah.
Does that go where you wanted it to go?
Yeah, no. I didn't have a direction where I wanted to go, but I was just really curious because you were kind of talking, and I know that actually anxiety is like something that I think, like I guess like we are more aware of hopefully by now, and and I think even like when it comes to children, when it comes to parents, I think there's like some awareness around, how can I guess like what are the ways or what are the coping strategies, and obviously still there is a huge need for more support. But I guess in relation to that, and it's also something that you've said before about, I guess, women being kind of diagnosed, I think less, but also can you just talk about that? Because I really find that fascinating that it's not something that also a lot of women can be diagnosed with for like various reasons. So yeah, just if you could share your experience with that.
Yeah, actually adding on one more thing to the last topic, anxiety a lot of times can look a lot like that PDA that we talked about. So if a kid is feeling really anxious about something in school, for instance, it may look outwardly like, I'm just not going to do that, when in reality the child is feeling like, I can't do that. There's no way. So that's just one extra overlap that I was thinking of. But turning to your current question about women and diagnosis with mood disorders, that tends to be the most common scenario I hear about when I'm talking with women over the age of 20 who have had challenges, they've had struggles in their lives. Many of them have gone to their therapists or their doctors and described the challenges they're having, and found that the providers are very quick to say, oh, it's just anxiety, or oh, it's just depression. Here, you can take these medicines or you can do these other things and it should fix it right up. And what the women find is they try that and they see varying degrees of success, usually fairly low degrees. And then they're stuck still wondering what in the world is going on. So hopefully at that point they find a provider with a little bit more range who is able to think about other things besides a mood disorder, able to evaluate for ADHD and consider the possibility that it has been there all along, and this person just has coped well until the point that they no longer can.
And I think it also, I guess goes kind of back to your point that you made in the beginning, about how kind of the manifestations of ADHD can be like very different as well. And I think it's I guess what you were saying, that kind of the name is not really helpful, because it kind of suggests that, you know, people who kind of have ADHD are going to be like hyperactive, or, you know, they're not going to be able to kind of concentrate on anything. And this is really not true, because a lot of people who have ADHD are very functional, you know, and they're actually managed to like be successful in a lot of things, you know, and you know, whether it's like being like entrepreneurs or like businessmen or like a therapist, or, you know. So I think this kind of whole, but I guess it just really creates that kind of misinformation in a way, as to kind of where a lot of people say, no, it's definitely not what I've been struggling with, or, you know, perhaps just like it's something different, or, you know, maybe it's like anxiety only, or maybe it's, so yeah, so it's quite confusing. And I also see how kind of that, I guess, journey, as a lot of women can potentially get diagnosed when their children get diagnosed, can kind of be like a way like to open a door into, okay, now you're kind of allowed to talk about this, as opposed to before it wasn't something that almost you would you know, just you would be seen for that, or it would be validated.
Yeah.
And
Another piece I think gets so confusing is the hyperfocus feature of ADHD. It doesn't happen for anybody, but it is pretty common. So often you hear, oh, well, you can't have ADHD because you're able to focus on things that interest you. You can focus when you want to. And that's almost a classic tip-off that ADHD is in the works, because it's not as much within the person's control as folks might think. There are ways where you can generate a little bit more focus when it's needed, but sometimes hyperfocus just grabs our brain and runs away with it. And so that gets really confusing too, for any age person, whether it's a grown woman going to the doctor and saying, well, most of the time I have trouble focusing, but with this thing I can really zone in, or a kid whose teachers are saying, well, the student can do the subjects that they really like, but they're just not focused in the other areas.
yeah, and I can just like see, you know, how that on its own can create so many challenges with like parenting, right? Because there's like this external demands, and, you know, and I think like there's like still so much kind of focus that, you know, just we as a society like place on achievements as opposed to efforts, you know, like on getting the grades, you know. And this is, I think, like some of the messages that I hear a lot from parents, you know, there's like this need, right, somehow, because then it's just going to be like a good enough, or, you know, so like this focus on like achievements, whether it's like something that, you know, like a child likes or not. But then ADHD kind of adds the whole different layer to that, even like this system is not able to offer, right? Because I still, and I know it's, I think, much more kind of, I think like the US is much more aware when it comes to ADHD, but I definitely know that like I'm in Portugal, but you know, I know that here it's still kind of something that a lot of schools don't have that capacity, you know, they don't have that awareness. They don't have like counselors or psychologists on board who have the knowledge. So I really think it's in many ways, it's so disabling for parents who just can't get any kind of support. And that's why I think this conversation, you know, is so important. And I just want to ask you, kind of as we're coming towards the end, so what would you think are the most I don't know, important messages for parents who might have a child with ADHD, or kind of suspect that they might have ADHD, or both? What do you think are the most important messages to be aware of, or kind of, I guess, permissions maybe, right? Or just an advice generally on what can we be like aware of as we're kind of navigating this whole world of ADHD, and what can it mean for the family and the dynamics?
One of the top messages I would want to reinforce is just what we talked about before, that knowledge is power. You have to know what you're dealing with first before you can deal with it. So if you or your child are having any kind of outsized struggles, I mean, of course, challenges kind of go in the course of anyone's daily life. But if you're finding that it's really too much to handle, I think it's a good idea to get to a provider, whatever kind of provider you can. You can even start by just asking around, taking a temperature check with other parents of your kids' peers. They're seeing at home. Not so much compare one kid to another, but just to kind of get a general idea of what is happening for that age group. There are also fantastic books and other resources out there to do a similar thing. So diagnosis is one. I'm a huge advocate for taking a strength-based approach and recognizing that different is good, different is not less, different is good. And to that end, if the parent thinks that they may be heading down the path of ADHD, either for themselves or their kids or both, one thing I love to suggest is for parents to start early and often talking about all kinds of differences that we see in the world. As they're out on a walk around the neighborhood, for instance, they might notice and point out to their kids the number of different architectural styles, the number of different kinds of cars we might see, or flowers, or cats or dogs, or anything, differences all around us. And so when parents begin to point those out and appreciate them and notice with their kids how boring the world would be if everything were exactly the same, how much fun it can be when we do find variety in the world, I think that goes a long way toward building a foundation of appreciating each other's strengths and bringing them together in a way that makes everyone's world richer. Beyond that, I think it's important to recognize each person as an individual. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all when it comes to ADHD. So beware of experts who say, if your child has ADHD, you must provide a rigid structure. Or if you have ADHD, then you must do these things. You must cut out sugar, or you must do anything. Blanket statements may be useful in some ways and to a certain degree, but we have to remember that every single person is different, and ADHD is a dynamic difference that, again, can change. It can be different from person to person, and it can change within one person. Of time, even very small increments of time. So those will be my top 3 takeaways.
And I thank you so much for that. I just think, it's such a powerful message as you were talking, about just kind of really normalizing, and even more than that, just kind of, just being aware and really, validating, but kind of celebrating the differences, how different we are. And, I think as you were talking about that, aspect of shame and how kind of tolerating shame can be specifically challenging for all of us, right? Because shame is not a feeling we're kind of equipped to work with in many ways, but especially in relations to ADHD. And I think what you've shared is really a way to work with that shame, because, as soon as we kind of verbalize it, normalize anything that we are ashamed of, it kind of loses its power, and it doesn't become something that we are internalizing. So I just really want to thank you for, this talk. I think it's so important, and it was like enlightening for me. I really learned a lot, and obviously I'm just aware how much there is still to learn. But yeah, just thank you so much for your time, and it was great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and hope that somebody finds some help here.
I hope so. Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.